In this video, we're going to be going through the printer settings portion of Cura. And this are the settings that are either going to make or break your print or decide if it's even going to print at all. There's about 500 plus settings within Cura that you can change around. Most of them you will never ever touch. They're very, very specific. But today we'll be going over a few of the major ones which you can absolutely go through and test and play around to make your print as accurate as possible. Within Cura, all of our settings are split up into different tabs that have lots and lots of different settings each that we can tweak to make your print be even better. When you go into each tab, you can either close or expand them to see all of the individual settings that will apply to different parts of your print. We won't be talking about every single setting, but we will be going into some that you'll come across all the time. Some of the ones that are very, very important, and some of them that you can use to just make very, very creative objects. As you go through some of the settings, you may notice that all the keywords within it actually duplicate some of the times. If you're going to search initial, then you'll be greeted with all of the settings that are specifically about your very, very first layer of printing. So as you go across, you will start to understand exactly how all of these settings are laid out. We'll start off today with the quality. Quality is kind of referring to how good your part will look based on the layer thickness. If you have your layer thickness too thick, then your part will print very, very quickly, but it won't look as good. It'll give you this kind of stair-step effect. But if you print with a smaller layer height, which would then increase the resolution, then your part looks much, much better, but it takes a lot longer. Generally, whenever I'm printing, I keep it at this 0.16 millimeter layer height, and I find it's a good balance between it doesn't take all that long, but it gives me a really good product on the other end. If I'm making something that doesn't really need to look all that good, then I know that I can just increase the layer height and it will print much faster for me. So currently, if I have it at 0.16 millimeters, then it will take about an hour and 57 minutes. But if I maximize the thickness on this, if I go to 0.28 millimeters and reslice it, then it will take only an hour and 18 minutes. So it's cut off almost, well, a pretty substantial amount of time for my print. But if I check out the preview of this, then you can see instead of having all of these nice sloping angles on all of our sections, it's a lot more blocky and it won't look as good because of it. In the other world, we also have initial layer height, which is how thick is our very, very first layer. And when you're talking about 3D printing, getting a good first layer is everything. If your first layer doesn't work, nothing will work. So generally, whenever I'm setting up all my settings for this, I will keep the rest of the layer height as 0.16, but my initial layer height to 0.28. And what this does is that it gives me pretty even layer thickness all the way up, except for the very, very first layer. If you can see, this one is just a little bit thicker. And because of that, we're putting more and more volume of material into the bed. And because of that, it takes a longer amount of time to cool down until it can grip onto the bed just a little bit more. Continuing on with that ideal, we also have the initial layer line width, which is how thick is your line, and I have currently set it to 150%. So if I make this 100% like it would be normally, then it means all of the layer lines that I put down on the very first layer are 0.4 millimeters, because that is the same diameter as our nozzle. But if I increase that to 150, then it means I'm laying down far more volume, and it means that very first layer is squishing out so much more because there's more volume going into it. And this is really going to give me a lot more adhesion. So if you're starting off with 3D printing and you don't even know what you're doing wrong because you can't even get a good print going because your first layer either is sticking too much or it's not sticking enough, this is a really good workaround. So as you're starting to print, you can nail your first layer and then you can worry about some of the little bit more tenuous details later. Now we're going to jump into the Walls tab. This is kind of discussing how many perimeters do you have within your part. When we slice our item and we say, I want 4 wall line count, it means when you're printing, you have got a perimeter of 4 shells. And it's a bit of a myth that if you want a really, really strong part when you're 3D printing, you just have a really, really high infill percentage, which is the material on the inside. And this actually isn't true. If you want a really, really strong part, you actually want to increase this number so it has a really thick shell. So when we go into the wall section, you're going to be greeted with wall line count. And this is a little bit easier for me to understand and gauge as far as how thick is my part going to be. When you first start with Cura, it's going to say, hey, do you want it in walls or do you want it in millimeters? And for me personally, I just find it a little bit easier to work with line count rather than millimeters, but it's perfectly personal preference. Going down, we also have things like optimizing wall print order, so it prints in the fastest path possible. We have things like filling in gaps in between wall. I actually don't want that because it generally adds a huge amount of time to my print. Anytime that I'm printing and it says, yeah, everything's just fine, but then there's some ever so slightly tiny gaps everywhere, it will try and go and fill those in. And for the most part, it doesn't add much in strength, it doesn't add anything in quality because it's all on the inside, so it just ends up adding a huge amount of time to my print. So I've said, yep, I don't really need that. I also want it to filter out very tiny gaps. I want to be able to print really thin walls. That's all good. I've got those things checked. I also have horizontal expansion and initial layer horizontal expansion. And this kind of goes into a little bit more of a troubleshooting side of 3D printing. Very often, if you're printing something that has square walls, something like a cube, you want it to be square all the way down. But what happens with a 3D printed object is on the very first layer, because you want your nozzle to be very, very close to your bed, it'll actually push outwards a little bit in a way that you don't really want. And so as it goes higher and higher and higher, that kind of pushing outwards kind of gets relieved, and so you end up with this curved radius at the very, very bottom. We call this elephant's foot. And there's a few different ways to cure this, whether you're going in the CAD side, whether you're doing this in Cura, or whether you're doing it in post-processing. I find it's a lot easier to do it in Cura. So I have printed out a part and I've measured it, and I've said, hey, this bottom layer is just a little bit too large. So as you can see in this example, it's actually going to pull in that bottom layer just a little bit. For example, if I wanted to print a 20mm calibration cube and the initial layer was 20 by 20 millimeters, but then I measured it and it was actually 22 millimeters, then I know I need to take off a millimeter on either end. I would put in -1 millimeters, and that would give me nice even straight lines on either side. The Z-seam alignment over here is referring to the area in a print where it actually goes upwards and then starts your next layer. This will give you a pretty visible seam all the way down your print, and a lot of people kind of say, hey, I want to get rid of this as much as possible. And there's no way to 100% eliminate it, but you can try and work around it in all different ways. The Z-seam position by saying, hey, I want to put it in the back corner. So if this is the main view of my 3D printed part, if that's the show side, then I want the kind of ugly scar, I would say, on the back side, as far away as you can get it. A lot of people refer to it as the ugly side of the Christmas tree theory, where if you've got a big gap, you kind of, push that against the wall. So continuing onwards, closing up walls and opening up the top and bottom. This whole section is very similar to the walls, but instead of on the outside of our print, it is obviously on the top and the bottom. So it has all very similar terminology to it. How many layers do you have on the very top? How many do you have on the bottom? Very often I will set 4 walls for almost all of my print. If I go fewer than that, then I find that the pattern on the inside, the infill, starts to push out a little bit, and I get all this kind of weird rippling surface on the outer edge. If I need a part to be pretty strong for kind of household use, then I'll make it 6 walls. If I want a part to be incredibly strong, then I'll end up making it 8 walls thick. And I'll have that number be exactly the same for the walls, the top, and the bottom. As it's printing, we can also say the pattern, how is it actually being laid down? And we have options of lines, concentric, or zigzag. Now the lines basically means that it's going to be printing at a 45-degree angle, and then for the next layer, it's going to be flipping back and forth. And this works in a very similar way to how plywood is made, where there is a grain direction of the wood, and the next layer is actually rotated 90 degrees. And so there is no weak section of wood, it's all incredibly strong. So as we go and check out the very, very first layer, you'll notice that it actually follows the grooves of our printed object. There are some words on the underside of the benchy, and so I've kind of said, hey, for the very first layer, I want you to make it concentric, so it kind of follows it. It doesn't make it stronger, it's just purely an aesthetic thing, but as soon as we jump up to the next layer, then we see that wall perimeter all the way around it, and we also have our 45-degree angle lines going on it. And then for the next layer, it goes in the opposite direction, and then back and forth. And then at a certain point, I now no longer have a very bottom layer. Now I'm going into the infill portion, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then same thing on as soon as it reaches the top section, then we've got our lines that go back and forth, back and forth. And this gives us a very, very strong print. A new or relatively new feature that you can find on Cura is something called ironing. Ironing is the it is purely the aesthetic part of 3D printing, where if you have a very flat portion of your print, something at the very top, and you want it to be as clean as possible, then you can enable ironing right here. And by enable ironing, it basically moves the very hot nozzle over the top surface just a little bit more. So if you have maybe some layer lines on the very top that all look separate, then it will radiate heat off the nozzle and it will start to melt and fuse that top layer together. There's a YouTuber called Chep that I really, really recommend people checking out. I think he has about 20 Ender 3s. Very, very familiar with Cura. He's a very, very knowledgeable YouTuber, and he's got a fantastic video on this. The very last feature we'll talk about in the top and bottom section is the skin overlap percentage. This is a feature that is purely about strength. When you're printing an object, and we'll go back down to some of the lower layers, there is a certain amount of distance in between where this line actually intersects with the walls. And what I've said is, hey, I want to have an overlap. I want the nozzle to actually move over and then actually start to print, not on the bottom, but into the walls over here. And this is actually going to fuse all them together because we are moving a molten plastic and kind of mushing it into an already solidified bit of plastic. So it gives you a significantly higher bit of strength there. And I've set it to about 30%. That would be 30% of the nozzle diameter. Remember, when you're talking about 3D printers, the hole, the orifice of the nozzle is pretty standard. 0.4 millimeters is the normal way to go, and that will also dictate exactly how many walls you have. So if you design something to have a 0.8 millimeter wall, then it will take 2 shells all the way around to make it that strong. And as we go through this, we're able to exactly say just how strong, just how thick is our wall going to be printing.